Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, the seminar, The Art and Science of the Business Story. The reason I'm running this event is the ability to tell a story as part of a presentation, as part of a training, as part of a influential meeting is one of the most crucial aspects of our verbal communication. So Peter Dew's my name. My story is simply that of a person who stutters, who stuttered badly growing up through young adulthood, and now I have faced my fear and I help people become more effective and more confident in their verbal communication. So I help people embrace, engage, be more effective through public speaking and the spoken word, because I want you to be able to share your messages, your ideas, your influence, your knowledge with your communities and your clients the way you want to. How to participate, please ask questions as we go. The chat box is open, so you can write your comments as you go. There's also a Q&A, but it's easier if you just stick within the chat box, so that's great. Take notes, participate, make comments, share your own personal insights, and think about your next presentation. What stories are you going to use? Are you going to take the risk and use stories? Do you already use stories effectively? What can you do to make them more impactful, more influential? The importance of this particular slide is if you listen, you say that's nice, and you don't change, then nothing much happens. So think about what one or two things you might take away and use into your own personal public speaking, presentation skill, event leading style. We all have a story to tell, and the story is important because we can use it to advocate for other people, to educate people. There's things that need to be spoken about and to change, and a pure objection or a pure putting forward of a new idea without something to create a story won't have impact. We can use it to influence people, to put new ideas forward, to put new thinking. This is an age where we need to be innovative and creative, to create change, to compel change, to explain the value of the change. This is through your storytelling, to help your message be quite memorable. We've all got stories to tell. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where to get stories from and also some common mistakes as well. So why tell stories? And I guess this is to some extent the crux of science and data behind telling stories. Stanford University did some research, and what they found was if you tell people information, so I do a phone call meeting with you and you hear my voice, I lecture to you and you hear my voice, about 1 in 10 of you, 10%, are going to recall what I've said in a week's time. The retention rate is 10%. And that's a really bad return on your investment, my investment in speaking to you and your investment in listening to me. If you add visual images, so a handout, some PowerPoint slides, you move to the flip chart and write on the board. I can share with you a whiteboard and we can do some work on the whiteboard. If you do some handouts, if you add that visual element, then you increase your retention rate to 30%. So 3 out of 10 will remember what I've said in a week's time. So that's still a poor return on investment. 7 out of 10 are going to walk out of this meeting, your lecture, your presentation, and not recall much of what you said. If you tell a story, you give an example, a case study, and it's engaging and creates emotion, and I talk about the visceral response in the gut, then the retention rate moves up to 75%. That's why you tell stories. And the little saying that we put with this information is, people don't remember much of what you have said. They remember how you've made them feel. So a story that creates this visceral, this gut response, hits me in the heart. That's what I'm going to remember. And that's why you tell stories. One other reason for telling stories is that they're your unique intellectual property. They're your case studies. They're the people you worked with. They're the difficulties you had. My story about overcoming my stutter, my debilitating, my life-limiting stutter, to now coach, train, and inspire people around the world to speak despite their fear, despite their uncertainty. That's my story. And people can't say, nah, no, I could never overcome my fear of public speaking. Yes, you can. And when people say, well, no, I don't believe that you stuttered that badly, I've got my video that I can show them of me stuttering badly. And all of that creates this visceral response, and people can't deny it. They can't tell me this is not possible. They can't say this won't work. So your stories are your unique intellectual property, rather than just regurgitating information, data, statistics. So with storytelling, I'm talking about a business story. I'm not talking about a bedtime story. Now, when I work with accountants, engineers, and geologists, for example, they are very strong on data. They're very strong on facts. They think that the numbers should be all that people need to change their mindset, to follow them, to accept their new idea. Here's the numbers, here's the data. Why won't you follow me? Because people don't buy data, they buy the story that goes behind the data. So when I'm working with accountants and engineers, I need to convince them of the value of the story. And you don't abandon the data, you still need the data. But what story are you going to use to display, to illustrate, to amplify the data you're talking about? And the data plus the story, this is the art of the business story, the art of telling the business story. The science is that 70 to 75% will remember the visceral, the gut response to the story. So the data, this is your examples, your case studies, your numbers, your statistics, your return on investment, your break-even analysis, your risk-reward ratio. You need that. This appeals to our logic, to our head, to our thinking. This is of course adapted from Dolan and Naidu, who wrote a book about story telling, two Australian authors. You do need the data. Then you need the story. So this is your personal stories. This is the overcoming adversity. This is your vulnerability. And even as a leader, vulnerability is a trait. And many leaders feel that they must demonstrate that they've never had any self-doubt. They've never made a mistake. Their journey to this leadership role has been one of, success after success after success. Welcome, Stacey. We've just got into it a little bit. So the stories that support your data, the stories that illustrate your data, your own personal struggle. I mentioned my story about overcoming my stutter, my fear of public speaking, the bullying, the pushback, the barriers, not just as a kid, as an adult working in hospitals within pathology labs. This is the stories. The stories appeal to the heart, to the gut, to your visceral response. Now, you may or may not know that we have three brains, not really three brains, three bundles of neurons within our body. The first one is our head. This is where we process. The second one is in our heart. It's called the bundle of His. It's an independent group of neurons that send a message to the heart to fire, to fire, to fire. And so we can be brain dead, but the heart will keep beating independently. It does not need the neurons in the brain to tell the heart to fire, to beat, to beat. And the third one is in our gut. And we make decisions on gut instinct. Now, this is not just tossing a coin, heads I'll do this, tails I'll go this way. This is knowing in your gut the right thing to do. Having an uneasy feeling that I shouldn't have done that when you know perhaps you've done something wrong. People make decisions on gut instinct. So this is the business story. The business story is the combination of the data and the story that illustrates it. The data appeals to the head, the story appeals to the heart, to the gut. They're what inspire, influence you, give you hope, light at the end of the tunnel. And you won't remember my 7-step process to overcome your fear of public speaking. But you've got my notes, you've got the handout, you've got the PowerPoint slides to remind you, you've got the book, the textbook, but in your guts, in your heart, you know, if Peter can do this, then I'm pretty sure I can do it. That's what influences, that's what persuades people, that's what people remember. And when I bump into people that have done my workshop 6, 7, 8 years after they've done my workshop, the thing they say is, Peter, I remember your amazing story. And I knew that I could do this public speaking thing. If I asked him, all right, what were the 5 key things within my process? Do you remember? Oh, I can't remember that, but I can remember that I knew I could do it. So we say head first, heart second. So please don't feel that I'm saying abandon your data, abandon your statistics, but back them up with a story that's going to add to what you're trying to say. And of course, the great Brené Brown, who talks about courage and vulnerability, says maybe stories are just data with a soul, data that makes our heart sing. So that's why we tell stories. Here's a simple model to tell stories. There are several models to tell stories, and this is a model that I want to share with you. And I'll bring it all together with an example of an embarrassing story of my own journey, So we need to make a point. So this is the point, this is the rationale, this is the change, this is the way forward, some sort of business point, some sort of point that we want our staff, our audience to take on board, to accept, to be influential. Then we tell a little story that illustrates the point. After the story, we reinforce the point. And here's the most important thing. We then roll it out and highlight the benefit or the value to you, the audience. So if I tell a story without a point, then I'm a stand-up comedian. If I tell a story without a point, I'm just saying hot air. I'm just indulging myself in my story. I'm just being a storyteller, a comedian, and that's fine if your role is to entertain. But most times when you're before a staff meeting or you're conducting a training or you're presenting at a conference, you're not there to entertain. Unless you are the stand-up comedian or the magician, you're there to influence, to impart knowledge, to educate. So if you tell a story and you make a powerful point, but I don't care, i.e. there's no value to me, there's no advantage in me, there's no reason for me to adopt your point, then you're telling the wrong story or making the wrong point, or you're speaking to the wrong audience. What's the benefit to the people in the room? The value. So that's a little model. Let me share with you that model in practice. And if I go back, you will also see the data. This is the point. And the stories, this is the story. You'll see these models run parallel. This is for the head, and this is for the heart. This is to help you remember. I'm going to make a point. I'm going to tell a story. I'm going to reinforce the point, reiterate it, repeat it, and try and make it valuable to you. So one of the things I always tell people speaking is make sure you know who's in the room. In fact, my latest newsletter coming out tomorrow will be how to do an audience audit. Who's in the room? Are there any cultural nuances you need to be aware of? Are you going to acknowledge the local traditional Aboriginals? Here in Perth it would be the Noongar people. Over in Bendigo it would be the Dja Dja Wurrung people. Are there any stories you're not going to tell because you may offend someone? What's the biggest problem of the people in the room? What's their headaches? How's your message going to help them? Make sure you know who is in the room. And the metaphor I use is walk 30 moons in your enemy's moccasins before you go to war. Native North Americans saying, walk 30 moons in your enemy's moccasins before you go to war. Try and understand them. My change on that metaphor, walk 1,000 steps in your audience's footsteps before you speak to them. Point. A few years back, I went to Kathmandu, to Nepal with my family to go trekking in the Annapurna. The Annapurna, the mountain tops, the foothills are absolutely magnificent. And you get to meet the Nepalese people. Some people found I was going to be in Kathmandu and they asked me if I would speak at their conference, a small conference of 50 people. Would I be the opening keynote speaker? I said, of course, it'd be my pleasure. I'm going to be in town. I'm going to be in Kathmandu. They're not going to pay me, but it's the least I can do for the Nepalese people. And what do you want me to speak on? Well, Peter, can you talk about storytelling? I understand that you're very good at storytelling. So I went on stage. I did no preparation whatsoever. I broke my own cardinal rule of know who's in the room. And I started very strong, as many of you will know. And I said, so who in the room's heard of Steve Jobs? Who's heard of Steve Jobs? And everyone in the room went, come on, you must have heard of Steve Jobs. You know, iPhone, Apple computers, iPods, you know, the tech guy, the Steve Jobs that's transformed computers. You must have heard of Steve Jobs. And everyone went, I don't believe it. You must have heard of Steve Jobs. And the young guy down the front said, Peter, we've all heard of Steve Jobs. And as you know, shaking the head from side to side means yes in Hindi. And all along they'd been saying yes to me, they've heard of Steve Jobs. And because I had not done my audience audit, because I hadn't taken the time to know who's in the room, to do a cultural audit, to speak to someone beforehand, and I would have picked up the little nod from side to side as they were in agreement, and I could have then taken that forward into the room. So I'm going to reinforce the point now. So if you don't want to look like an idiot, so make sure you do an audience audit before you go into the room. Who's in the room? What do they want from you? And if you don't want to look like an idiot, if you want to look really well, really good, really professional, as though you care, as though you understand your audience, please know who's in the room before you speak to them. And just as an aside, the young man came up to me afterwards and he said, Peter, that's the best presentation I've ever heard. So, a simple model to make a point, tell a story, reinforce the point. There needs to be value and some purpose for the audience. So I encourage you, as you go forward in your training, education, speaking journeys, take the time to know who's in the room. I'm going to pause for a moment. Just type in any comments. So Sarah says, where do you get your stories from? All right, good one. Just hang on for a moment. I'm going to cover that one, Sarah. So where do you get your stories from? Stories are everywhere. Those mistakes you make. Me speaking in Kathmandu without doing an audience review, without taking the time to arrive early, be respectful. The people you meet will share stories, the problems you solve, the unexpected events, everyday life, the adversity, the setbacks, the barriers that you overcome. I mentioned my story of overcoming my stutter. This is my seminal, my story that positions me in the public speaking training and the public speaking coaching space. The best stories are those that come from the heart rather than the head. So don't design or write a story. It's just something that happened. And I still keep in touch with that young man from Nepal. He's a friend, and I remember that story. The story is going to stay with me forever. And so now I've made other mistakes in walking into a room and not doing an audience audit. Not anymore, so I can use other stories to illustrate the same point. So stories are everywhere. One of the things that I recommend is you build a bank of stories. So you have a point. So my point was, know your audience, know who's in the room. So what stories support that? I've got my Nepalese story. I've got the other story where an Aboriginal person came up to me and said, I would have liked you to acknowledge the traditional landowners. So this is my bank of stories that illustrate, that I collect to illustrate the same point. So when I go to present, depending on who's in the room, I can choose which story I use for which audience. So it's almost like a palette, and I can choose which story, which color to use to match the audience needs. So I call that my bank of stories. This is the point, and there's many, many stories, everyday life stuff that happens that once again illustrates the point. I should have done an audience. And it's important to own these mistakes and not be embarrassed and acknowledge that vulnerability. And yeah, it's okay to have mistakes and it's okay to admit them. The important thing is not to go back to Nepal and make the same mistake. So make a mistake once, learn quick, adapt, change, and move on with that lesson. All right, common mistakes. Storytelling, marketing. It's the great marketing guru, Seth Godin. And this illustrates to me about storytelling. And when you educate, when you influence, when you speak on a change management process, when you train, you are marketing a new idea. You are marketing information. The marketer's job then is to tell a true story, one that resonates, one that matters to people. So the value, the benefit to your audience, and to repeat it often enough that it creates value to you, the audience. So common mistakes with storytellings: not using your own personal stories. Every now and then you need to borrow a story. You hear a story from a high source. You don't have your own personal story that illustrates the same point. It's stronger to use your own story. Not letting the audience know in advance. So I'm going to share a story with you that illustrates the point. Using the wrong story. Framing. This is called framing. So remember, I did the bank of stories with different stories. When I work with the mining sector, I tell different stories to when I work with the health and disability sector. When I work with the financial planning, the accountants sector, then I need a different set of stories again. Using the wrong story with the wrong audience won't have the same impact. Using old stories, stories that are worn to death. Have you heard the story about the tortoise and the hare? Slow and steady wins the race. Making yourself the hero of the story. So when I mention my stuttering story, I need to let people know that you too can succeed. It's about you doing the preparation. It's about you doing the work. It's about you facing your fears. It's about you taking risks. You need to join a Toastmasters club. You can do this. A really good story at the end of the day makes your audience walk out feeling that they are the hero. Don't make yourself the hero of your own story. And having to explain the story. It's a bit like a joke. You know, when you tell a joke and you've got to explain the punchline. If you've got to explain the meaning of the story or interpret the story, it's probably not the right story to use. So they're common mistakes. I've got some upcoming workshops online. On Wednesday, The Art and Science of Influence. This is a paid online seminar. Anyone can do this. Overcoming self-doubt, that's Violet's. Difficult Conversations on the 18th of June. This is Eastern Standard Time, so this is going to be 7:30 a.m. WA time, as is Presentation Skills online. Then in Perth, because I can now do face-to-face, How to Have Difficult Conversations, 24th of June, face-to-face, Speaking Off the Cuff, 25th of June, Assertiveness, 26th, and Difficult Conversations, 30th of June. Some free webinars coming up for you. The Secret of a Strong Opening, 11th of June. So normal WA time, 30-minute short one. This is a paid online seminar. How do I overcome nerves and fear of public speaking, and how to move into that space of being more present and engaging, and being able to deal with those fears, those anxieties, and how to create a memorable message. And storytelling is just one of the ways of creating that memorable message. You know how to reach me. I'd welcome your comments and feedback. Now remember, storytelling. If you're an accountant, you're an engineer, I know you need the data, but people don't always remember just what you've said. Fact, fact, fact. They remember how you make them feel, that visceral response. Storytelling is one of those ways of creating that visceral response. This is Peter Dew. Bye for now.